Hello, hi everyone. My name's Karen. I am the founder of The Projector and also the co-founder of Docomomo Singapore, which is a non-profit that focuses on the documentation and also conservation of modernist buildings in Singapore. So welcome and thank you for joining us tonight in our panel. They told us to move a conversation on community displacement and conservation. So before we start, I will begin with a shameless plug on two of our films that we're screening at the projector at the moment. The first one is Gagarine, and we're showing this exclusively at the projector for all this month. It's a directional debut by Fanny Liatard and Jérémy Trouilh. And the film was also part of the official selection of the Cannes Film Festival in 2020. It's set in a modernist housing project built in 1958 in the outskirts of Paris. And it centers on a teenage boy that upon hearing about its impending demolition, he embarks on a mission to save the building and eventually in the process also transforms the estate into his own spaceship. So the film was shot on location on the cusp of its demolition. And it also, I think, features its actual residence as part of the film as well. We'll hear more from the directors later on this. So it's a blend of fantasy and reality and some documentation and talks about displacement and marginalized communities. And so we highly, highly, highly recommend that you come and support this film. It's definitely worth watching and it's beautifully shot. It will be shown at the projector all this month, exclusively at the projector. The other film that I'm going to plug is Tiong Bahru Social Club. We've screened this one before, but we are doing some limited exclusive screenings at the projector this national holiday weekend. So do come and see it. And for those who are not aware of Tiong Bahru Social Club, where have you been? It is an offbeat satire comedy, which takes, a whimsical and soft sci-fi approach to poke fun at Singapore's preoccupation with results-driven practicalities. It was also the opening film of the Singapore International Film Festival last year, 2020, and it was also shot in the estate of Tiong Bahru in Singapore and on location at Pearl Bank, which is another large modernist housing building that has since been demolished. So we see quite a lot of intertwining parallels between these two films, and we'll kind of touch on that later in the discussion. So that was the plug for our films. Before we start the panel, I would also like to thank Anticipate Pictures for bringing in Gagarine and also Unifrance for their generous support of this film. So I will now introduce the members of our panel. We have, of course, the directors themselves of Gagarine, Jérémy and Fanny.
Hello.
We also have, hi guys, how are you doing? They're currently in Tuscany in Italy and taking time off the summer to spend an hour or so with us to talk about their film. So thank you guys for being generous with your time and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we also have Bee Thiam, who is the director of Tiong Bahru Social Club. Hi, Bee Thiam. Thank you for coming.
Hello.
And we have Jonathan Poh, who is a local architect and of Provoke Architects, and also a partner in Waito, which is a French architecture practice based in Singapore. He has also been instrumental in a ground-up initiative to save something called Dakota Crescent in Singapore. And Dakota Crescent was the last of the remaining post-war housing estates that was slated for demolition in 2014. It has since been, part of it was saved eventually as a result of his initiative, but part of it was also demolished in 2016, and residents unfortunately also had to move out of there. Which brings me to our final member of the panel, Jérémy Ho. Hi, Jérémy. Thanks for joining us. Jérémy is an independent documentary maker, documentary filmmaker, and video producer. And one of his projects and his work actually focuses on cultural and social issues. So he's covered topics from, the rise of youth in Pakistan to the working class in Korea. And one of his projects is actually a project called In Between Two Homes. And that came together in 2016 and involves, interviews and documentation of the Dakota Crescent neighborhood. And it's a case study on how the community can kind of come together to kind of preserve memories of a place. So with that, let us kick off with the panel discussion. So I guess we'll start off with the directors of Gagarine. I was wondering, what your motivation, if you could tell us a bit more about your motivation to focus on this sort of topic for your debut feature, and how you got involved in the film and how it came about. How did you kind of come into contact with that sort of, with the estate itself and the residents? And if you could tell us a bit about that journey and that story, that would be wonderful.
Okay. Maybe we can tell you the beginning of the history of how we made Gagarine.
Yes.
With Jérémy, we studied together, but not films. We studied a bit urban planning, so architecture, but we never worked in this field. And when we started to make movies, we arrived in Paris. We are not from Paris, and we met the social housing project Gagarine in the outskirts of Paris, because some architects' friends were working on the future demolition of the building, and they invited us to make documentary portraits of inhabitants to have a bit their feelings about the demolition coming. And when we arrived in the place, we kind of fell in love with the building because it was so impressive, this big red bricks building with such a weird history of an astronaut coming to inaugurate this place in the 60s. And then we were touched by the inhabitants we met, and learning that all the stories of life, of family stories, was going to disappear. So we had the instinct to, it's important to make a fiction here, also because Gagarine was a place who had a bad reputation, and I don't know why, but we saw so many beauty when we arrived, and every time more when we started to meet people there. And so we decided to write a short film first. It was a 15-minute film named Gagarine, and the story was quite the same, but it was the story of Yuri, a young guy who sees his building as a spaceship. And it was the beginning of a big story of friendship with a lot of inhabitants, because we spent 6-7 years in the place, seeing the inhabitants going away of the building little by little, but also writing a feature film where they were going to act and participate in many forms. So that's the resume of the story.
And was the community involved in the? I think I read somewhere that you also involved the residents in the filming eventually, not just actors. And what was the response to that? And how were they involved?
Well, it was important for us to make the movie with the inhabitants and not about them without them, So
Yeah.
to be able to do that, we spent a lot of time with local associations of women, of young people, and eventually we even made short films of fiction and documentary with many people from the housing project, and they helped us a lot to understand what they were going through, and it gave us many small details about the personality of many characters we invented, And at the very end of the process, when we were finally able to shoot the film in the actual building that was completely empty, many inhabitants accepted to come back to their former home to be part of the cast. So in the movie, you see hundreds of inhabitants who are playing their part in the film, and some of them even helped us behind the camera, helping us directing the cast or building things for the setting. So it was a very collective experience, and they took part in a large way in the construction of the film.
That's actually really actually really quite moving. I think it's almost like your project kind of turned into a collective sort of repository for them to. It's almost like they build something, in remembrance of their space. If I'm not romanticizing it too much, but I think that's really quite nice. It's in part also
Thank you.
documentation.
Thank you. We hope.
And I also noticed that you kind of also spliced in scenes of just like people walking around and just like standing in their balconies and stuff like that. Is that like scenes from actual documentation that you had done before you had started your feature, embarked on your feature project?
It was yeah, so for those who saw the movie, it mixes realism and science fiction a bit.
Yeah.
So for us, it was very important to find the right balance between these two genders, and for that, it was very important for us to show the life, how this neighborhood is alive. So we, with our DOP and a very small team, during the weekends of the shootings, 2 years, we were going just with the camera to catch these moments of people outside walking in the. So there are really people of the documentary parts of the film completely.
Yeah, it's really quite. Yeah, that's really cool.
Sorry, of course, it wasn't possible to shoot the documentary life of Gagarine because Gagarine was empty at that time. But we had a twin building 500 meters from Gagarine that was here full of inhabitants, and so we cheated a little. Most of the film was shot in Gagarine, but for some life scene, which couldn't be shot in Gagarin because it was surrounded by a demolition team. We shot it in the twin building, and that's also there where we shot the documentary part of daily life inhabitants.
Right. Oh, cool. I mean, is it a cheat or is it just, the principle is that I suppose the spirit conveyed is accurate. Hopefully. Sure. When I think when I watched the film, it really felt like, and I hear you talk about it, where my original question was also whether you guys, in the process of making the film, fell in love with the building as well, because the character of Yuri, he obviously loves the building and he wants to save it, and he repairs bits of it, and he eventually, it's almost like he transforms it from some vision in his mind into reality, into a spaceship, and then like it gets a bit surreal and quite beautiful. But the whole thing, it felt really, really intimate, the relationship that this character had with the building, and also in the way it was shot, the eye for many, many little details in the building, like the stairways, like the little maybe corridors. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about the like the mise en scène in terms of how you were trying to portray that, and how the process was in terms of looking at the building, how you kind of placed the characters and everything in
it? Yes. As I was saying, it was a challenge to find this balance. How how much onirism we could put into a very realistic context of the building. So what we found, I think, as a guideline was the magical part of the mise en scène. The will be coming from Yuri's eyes only. So little by little, the character is getting more and more lonely alone in his building, and its imagination will take all the place, all the space. So in terms of image and colors, and we had this base of telling us and with our DOP and in the decorium also, that the color of Yuri is the blue of the daily color of Yuri, and when it's going into its imagination and into space, the red is starting to come in the image, and also the movement, the camera movements are getting like floating, like in weightlessness, little by little. It's coming also in the sound, not only in image. The science fiction is entering the movie really by little touches, and I will not tell the hand for those who haven't seen, but it's getting bigger and bigger.
Non, c'est bien.
And is there, and have you shown the film to the end product, to the residents, and have you had any feedback from it?
Yeah, it's been a long wait before being able to show the film to them, because it was, as you said before, selected in Cannes 2020, so 1 year and a half ago. And normally we would have been so proud and happy to bring all the inhabitants to climb the red carpet all together, of course. And so it was 2 difficult years for everybody, of course. And so we could show them the movie only 2 months ago. And it's been a beautiful moment. There is a local cinema next to the former Gagarine. Now Gagarine isn't there anymore, but the cinema is still here. And so we did a beautiful evening all together, pretending we were in Cannes all together. But and yeah, I think it was very moving because, for instance, I remember talking with a woman who lived there for 15 years and was telling us that not only Gagarine, the movie, was becoming a memory object for her, but also she was saying that somehow it kind of helped her to go through the process of acceptance of leaving this place. And we felt really, really welcomed by this community, which is so diverse, and also from their different points of view. Not everyone loved Gagarine as much as Yuri. Some people were tired of this building being abandoned and they wanted to go. But at the moment of watching it all together, I think it gave us the opportunity to remember the strengths of this community. And so, of course, it was a strong moment for us.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think, you know, there's always that bittersweet sort of like push and pull when you know, communities are forced, asked to kind of leave their homes, you know, and some of them, I mean, that exact dynamic, I think, is something that Bee Thiam and Jérémy and John, you know, in our work with other sort of similar situations, like it's a theme that threads through all of the kind of situations where, you know, people asked to leave a building that is kind of being run down because, you know, the push factor is that it's, you know, it's not well maintained, and so it's less comfortable to live in. But then there's also very high levels of attachment and sentimentality that they have to grapple with. So it's always that push and pull dynamic that's prevalent. But it's really heartening to hear that your film gave them a cathartic sort of outlet in terms of expression and maybe even closure. And, you know, we'd also, I think, want to hear from Jérémy and John later on about their experiences with residents moving out of their homes what happened, what transpired as well. So thank you very much for sharing, Fanny and Jérémy, your experiences of doing the film with us. To our audience, please watch it. It's really beautiful, and now that you know the backstory, you really hopefully are compelled to have a look, to sit through the film and enjoy it and see it in a different light. Just moving on to Bee Thiam and Tiong Bahru Social Club. So in your film, you mentioned, well, actually in interviews, you have mentioned that in Tiong Bahru Social Club, it's what you call a reverse shot of Tiong Bahru and the Pearl Bank building. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about this and your choices of these two spaces as actual characters in your film?
Sure. Yeah. So I think as a filmmaker,
and sorry, before we continue, I apologize, but to the audience, if you'd like to ask questions to anyone in this panel or have any comments, please send it to our Facebook chat. Sorry, Bee Thiam, over to you.
Okay. So I think as a filmmaker, I am very interested in what people remember and what they forget. So when I was looking at spaces in Singapore, Tiong Bahru Social Club, Tiong Bahru and Pearl Bank being just a stone throw away from each other, when the news came that Pearl Bank is going to be demolished, I always wonder what would Pearl Bank say to Tiong Bahru, which was built actually in the 30s before Pearl Bank was even developed and built. So I think unlike Gagarine, right, where it is more almost a floating kind of camera, our camera is still. So it is really like two buildings looking at each other. So that becomes, I think, the premise of the film. Tiong Bahru that was built before the war, and one of the oldest public developments in Singapore. That today, it became one of the hippest. It was very much loved. That people are actually wanting to pay high rental, to want to stay there. Versus Pearl Bank that was built in the 70s by a private developer. But yet it went through, neglect, and that after almost 30, 40 years, that people were actually, trying to put together en bloc to try to leave, to sell the place collectively, and to demolish it. So I always feel that while we may want to preserve a space, right, why and how we treat buildings and spaces, right, actually reflect more about us as a society, what is important to us, as social memories, and what are not. So that became the basis of really the film, right? Having the Pearl Bank and Tiong Bahru as almost characters in the movie. Yeah.
And I think there was a scene where you had a young-ish fellow espouse the benefits of keeping Pearl Bank, and he was standing on this podium and he was saying that we should keep it because it's for heritage reasons and so on. And then thereafter you have him being sort of carried off by a bunch of residents or older residents. What were you?
I guess I'm
thinking of.
I feel like I'm that old. I'm that young protester. Like someone from the outside who wish, for these spaces to be conserved. That I feel. I mean, for me, I feel that demolishing any kind of building, right, especially buildings that have been lived, by people, is really an act of violence. Not only to the people who live there, but to the society. I mean, 10 years ago, myself, I have to move out of where I live because of also another en bloc kind of situation. And my primary school is no longer there, right? So it's only been like 20, 30 years, but yet, my childhood, where I grew up, where I studied, is all taken away from me, right? And today I have vague memories of what it looks like, how it was like, what I was doing there, but I would no longer be able to relate, those things to people, because there's nothing physical, there is nothing left, right, of those spaces. So I think that violence is what I wanted to portray, but at the same time, I feel that there are also people, who wanted to perhaps leave and move on to something that is new. And I wonder whether I'm that, a minority that is wanting to do so. In fact, when we were filming and trying to film in Pearl Bank, it was actually quite hostile. Almost as if, even when we contacted people who allowed us to shoot in their flats, in their units, they have to keep it very discreet. If not, they would be seen as the opposition. And the rest of the residents would then, feel like they are the betrayers, who might sabotage the sale. So it was a very different feeling shooting in Pearl Bank versus shooting in Tiong Bahru, where it was really welcoming. People were in fact, happy for us to be filming there, capturing a part of, what they feel very proud of. So that was what I was interested to capture, right? What people want to remember and what they want to forget. Yeah.
Cool. And I mean, it's interesting how the reaction to kind of like even just like someone coming in and making a film in the environment sort of almost is a mirror to kind of like the incumbent community sort of general sentiment towards the building. So that's really interesting. And did you actually have any residents like be sort of involved in the process of making your film from either Tiong Bahru or Pearl Bank?
Tiong Bahru, yes. Pearl Bank, not really. We have people who allowed us to film in their places, in their units, but in a very hush way. But in both places, actually, we spent a few years, right, talking to people who have lived there, through oral histories and through what we have read and through research. I think we try to put, them in the film, what we have gathered, not just the stories, but also how people feel about these places. Yeah.
Cool. And I think the other question that we also had was like your use of sci-fi and maybe fantasy is as a device is similar to Gagarine. I mean, and probably a coincidence, but for you, why that approach?
For me, when we conceptualized the film, I think we want to build it on, I think, the oral histories of people who have lived there or who have stories about the place. But we know that it is not a documentary. And I think just like how I have, experienced en bloc and stuff like that, I feel that it is a way for me to recreate and a way for me to use sci-fi and fantasy to create an alternate universe, right? An imagined world where I hope, right, to remember the place by. So it went then beyond what is real, but also I think what is the hand, right, behind what is going on. So I think recreating a whimsical world where there is uncanny symmetry, almost as if there is an invisible hand trying to shape, right, the whole urbanscape, right, as if it is a bonsai. So that was what we were going after, a retro-futuristic kind of approach, almost as if the past is imagining the future, right, revisiting, I think, the architects of these spaces when they were thinking of these buildings, building them. I think what were their hopes and expectations, right, of the kind of communal living, right, that they were trying to go after. So yeah, so it is, when you look at Tiong Bahru Social Club, it is also a film that is not set in a particular period, right? It is not the past, it is not the future. So we imagine it as as a film where it is almost like augmented reality, where you can see both the past and the future stacked on top of one another in a very timeless kind of world. Yeah, so that was what we were going after.
Thank you for sharing. Actually, that same question could be applied to also Fanny and Jérémy, like, you know, your use of kind of fantasy overlaid on reality as a device. Like, what kind of led you to tell us a bit more about what led you to kind of doing that, you know, using that approach?
For us, science fiction or space was a part of the history of the place.
Mm-hmm.
And for us, it was the perfect way to make a step aside in the way we are watching this type of place, because Gagarine is one of the many social housing projects you have around Paris and around all the cities in France. And it's a bit caricatural, but they have mainly bad reputation. Many of them has been destroyed. So we wanted to just have another look, because in cinema, in films, in the medias also, many times we talk about these places, we are talking about drug dealing or violence and traffic, and so we just wanted to have another look, and using space was a game also, and the perfect way to do that, I think, for us.
It almost kind of like, again, I think encourages the viewer to, it almost sparks them to kind of just really just take a step back and remove themselves from what they know about a certain building and look at it from a really such a different perspective that, you know, it gives them a fresh pair of eyes to kind of look at the same physical space. I suppose that's something that possibly also results of that.
Well, it's true that, as Fanny said, it's strange that for a certain type of territories, you always hear the same type of stories. And if you look at Gagarine, if you knock at every door of the 370 apartments that existed, you will find one different and singular story for each apartment, each window. So what we really tried to do was to get intimate was one of the inhabitants, a fictional one, but with one vision. And if you get intimate with one vision, of course it will change all the vision you ever had of this place, because it will be very particular. So we chose a young man who is between childhood and adultness, and who still has huge dreams. And those dreams, this love for community, changes everything he looks around. So then we have to find a balance between the daily life that was important for us to show, and that is shot in a somehow kind of naturalistic way, and fantastic, for oneristic part. And so to find this balance, on the same way I was talking about finding one individual to talk about a vision, we chose that all the way we would shoot the movie would be impacted by always Yuri's feeling and Yuri's point of view. So the movie kind of begin in a naturalistic language, because he is surrounded by many inhabitants, and little by little, because the people go away and he little by little finds himself alone with this building, he goes deep in his emotions and his dreams. And here the way we shoot begins to transform, to go further in science fiction style.
Yeah, I think that was I really enjoyed that transition, like throughout the film.
Thank
and
you.
I think I maybe cannot talk too much more about what happens without being without having it be a spoiler. So we will just leave it at that. Just moving on, also to John. You know, we talked about Poh Bank and Tiong Bahru Thiam's film. but also, these aren't the only kind of buildings in Singapore that are, or rather Pearl Bank was one where, it was demolished and residents were asked to move. And admittedly also, as Bee Thiam mentioned, not all of them wanted to stay as well. But Dakota is another sort of situation where, we have an old SIT housing estate that's been around since the 50s, with residents that have lived there for a large part of their lives, and, they were kind of told to move at short notice and kind of uproot themselves. In your work with this project, I was wondering if you could share a bit more about, what your experience was with this, and also why you think such buildings are worthy of conservation, especially in Singapore.
Okay. First, when you gave me this opportunity to watch the film, I was actually quite amazed at the uncanny resemblance of Dakota and Gagarine. I didn't expect it to be so similar, because both were actually built somewhere in the 1950s and 60s. Dakota was built in 1956 and completed in 1959. Whereas I think Gagarine was inaugurated in 1963. Right? I don't know how long did they take to construct the building, but I think the time in which these buildings were built were quite similar. Right? So I think, and then fast forward to today, where Fanny and Jérémy actually captured, the emotions and the feelings of Yuri. I mean, that also brought back memories of me going into the estate for the very first time after the announcement of its demolition, where I went in and I thought, oh no, I something must be done to this place. So really, I think there's so many parallels that I thought can be drawn between the two films. Now, in terms of the people that actually lived in Dakota, I think they shared similar experiences. I remember when they were handed the letter of eviction, many of them didn't understand the letter at all, because a lot of them are quite old. They have lived there for quite a huge part of their lives, but the fact is that they are quite elderly and they don't have very good education, so that's why they had problems trying to understand, what next. You see, they know that they have to be evicted, but what next? So there was a very kind gentleman who actually runs a senior care center there by the name of Roger. He helped to actually translate all these letters to these these residents who have these letters. You see, so slowly and slowly, the residents there started to understand what is their fate and what they needed to do. So, in terms of the sentiments of the residents, I think it was also quite similar to even Pearl Bank and Gagarine, or both. There are people, there are naysayers. People say, the building's so old already, and then there are people there who are actually wheelchair bound, on walking sticks, and the lifts only serve 3 floors out of the 7 stories. Right? Can you imagine that? How do they even climb down the staircases? And the staircases are slippery also. So to some of them, when they hear this news, I think they have mixed feelings. On the one hand, they are thinking, oh, they're being moved to a new HDB flat, and it's the environment's probably going to be better. But what I understand is that they have some fears of moving, because the apartment block that they're going to move to is quite tall. I think it's more than 15 stories, if I remember correctly. So it's going to be the first time that some of them are going to live in high-rise apartments. So there is this fear that some of them have in their minds. There are some that actually hold on very true to their memories of Dakota still. I think, and Jérémy, I think, definitely knows of this guy by the name of Billy. He's a main installation in Dakota. He lives in this 2-story building in Dakota, along near the riverfront. And I think every time there's an opportunity to talk about Dakota to the media and all that, he's the first one to jump out because he has so much to talk about in terms of his recollection of how he lived there, how crocodiles sort of came up to his flat, so on and so forth. So I think we have this very, very diverse views of this move, right? Now, if you ask me, what's the importance of keeping these flats, I say when I first got into this project, I didn't know much about it, right? So I live not too far away from this group of housing blocks. So when I got news that this place is going to be demolished, I mean, me and my friend, I just told my friend, hey, let's just make a casual trip down, right? I mean, just to see what's the big deal about it. I mean, I didn't know what's going to happen after that. So when I went down, I went in, in case you guys don't know, Dakota is actually a group of flats that surround a few courtyards, right? They are 7 stories high. There's some long blocks, some are butterfly-shaped blocks, right? Some are short blocks. So there are few blocks that sort of surround courtyards, right? And within one of the courtyards, there's actually an iconic playground, right? And it's because of these the layouts of these apartment blocks that allows the estate to be shielded off from the hustle and bustle of the noisy streets outside of the estate, right? And that makes it quite unique. So I was walking from the outside, which is this very busy street, into the estate. And when I crossed that threshold, right, that was when I felt that connection, because that was when I realized, hey, the environment is so different, right? I'm sure, when you go to Gagarine, Cité Gagarine, the environment is equally different, right? For Dakota, I felt the same thing. I went in and then I was transported to another world, right? Everything was so low, right? There's trees, there's nature everywhere, birds chirping. I never heard that before anywhere else or in any estate, right? So that was the first reaction that I had. The second, so after that sort of spurred me to do like research and all that, and that's where I realized the buildings there are one of a kind in Singapore, and that's where I think there's a very dire need to save them because of its rarity. There's nowhere else in Singapore has them, and there are people that come in and out of this estate that says that told me, and even Ying Zhou, who was actually one of my co-partners in this campaign, that whenever they come to this place, they remember Singapore back then in the 1980s and 90s. And it's quite true because these same buildings actually once built everywhere else in Singapore, right? But this is the remaining one in Singapore. So it is important to keep it because it sort of invokes this kind of collective memory of what Singapore used to be, and therefore it makes people feel that there's a sense of belonging to Singapore and probably to the neighborhood as well. So yeah, that's the significance. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing. And just on that, Jérémy, what would you be able to share? What kind of inspired you to embark on your project on Dakota, and also your experiences when working with the residents on it? If you could tell us a little bit more about your journey and your experience, that'd be great.
Okay, so I worked on a documentary called, as in the multimedia website. So it's a sort of an interactive documentary called Between Two Homes about the rental flat residents. So I think while John was working on Dakota Crescent and also pushing for architecture to be safe, on the other hand, we realized, very similar to Gagarin, you have this very beautiful, majestic buildings, right? But on the inside also, so there's both a strong history of heritage, and also, but yet every door, like you said, every door you knock on, you find a very deep personal history. And I think that it was that when we realized that there's this vulnerable communities that people are not talking about and not focusing on, that we decided to bring that to light. And I think that's ultimately what we plan to do. And yeah, so the similarities are uncanny in that way. And I think one thing I liked about Gagarine, if I can say, is the idea of using that the space metaphor for Yuri, right, the main character. I like that. And it's a bit like Billy in ours, but it's the sense that, people living in these buildings want a better life, right? And the idea of escaping, but it's not the building that they want to escape. The building is home, but it's that they want to bring their home with them and transcend to another level. I think the way you guys brought it together was really nice. Yeah. And I think in a sense that's what a lot of the people, like, what people don't get when you talk to the rental flat residents. It's not that they're like, oh, here's a new flat for you, right? Why are you not happy? They always like say, why are you so ungrateful? We're going to give you a new flat. But yet it's not the same because it's smaller, or, I mean, in our case it's smaller, but even it's not the same because it's not just about a space, right, in your own box. It's also about the friends you've made and the networks of support that has been built over the years. Like, I think depicted in the early scenes of Gagarine, where you see it's very informal. These informal things codify over time, and I think, like what Bee Thiam was saying, demolition is an act of violence. It's very visible, but the other act of violence we don't see is the breaking down of these networks, and how, especially for someone who's already very old and you put them into a completely new setting, like how can they build that again? Like, I'm not so sure. Yeah, so I think, there's another aspect in the film which I liked, which it's I think the secondary character who set up camp nearby. Like, I think that's the idea of that transience and like, like that you don't get once your home is taken away from you, that stability. So yeah, so in a similar way, I think that's one thing we feel about Dakota. I still volunteer with a movement called Castle Resettlement Team that came in the wake of this, and we are still like figuring out or like supporting the residents like 2 years after the move. So it's a continued like impact, even from something as simple as, I think it's just moving house, but it's not the same when it comes to vulnerable communities. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the general sense is that, it's not just a simple physical move, even though it just involves a physical building, but it's also the uprooting of communities and breaking of bonds and adjustments that basically take much longer than than just the physical transformation. We actually also have some comments and also some questions from the audience, which I'm going to pose to the panel. So Minsa basically asks if there are any more places like Gagarine in France or Dakota in Singapore which we should see or take note of before it's too late.
Everywhere.
For in France, yes, there are many places like Gagarine, and some of them are protected by the law, so they will not disappear. So, and there is a photographer who made a very beautiful series of photos about it's like remembering the future, the name of the series, and his name is Laurent Cronenthal. I can write it on the chat, so you can see photos of very futuristic buildings of the past, which are very interesting, and for the little story, one of them was the decorium of Hunger Games. So there are these places inspiring many directors, and they still exist. They will stay standing. I will write it on the chat.
Thank you. How about How about you, John or Bee Thiam or Jérémy? In terms of Singapore, are there any other? I know you guys said many, but would you care to maybe list a couple of the more noteworthy few?
I was
This is where we
visiting.
can. So
Sorry,
you can
go
shout
ahead.
out.
We all want to say something.
Okay. We'll do one each, starting with Bee Thiam.
I was visiting Docomomo's website, and I think it really brought back memories of our location scouting for the movie. We were looking at diamonds, the diamond building, and a lot of other places. But I think one of the other places which I really love is really Golden Mile Complex. Yeah, where Projector is housed.
And we're housed actually in the sister building, Golden Mile Tower, but yes, we also love Golden Mile Complex,
Yeah.
where Jonathan's former office was housed, I think.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, I moved out. Yeah. I think for me, it's Red Hill Close. I don't know whether you guys see that. I mean, it's slowly, it's slowly going away because there's not much news about its demolition. The Red Hill Close is also 7-story high SIT flats. So I think there's a tender for the demolition to happen already. So please go and see it before it goes away.
Interestingly, me and my friends, we also made a film in Red Hill Close about I think 10 years ago.
Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
and it was actually where our actress lived. So we shot at her place. So she was en bloc. Guess where? To the Pinnacle.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say I was gonna just shout out that about Karen's and John's new, because there's quite a few buildings, but their new venture, or like basically the Singapore chapter of a Denmark initiative, right? Docomomo. So there's a whole repository on their website of these buildings that might be going soon. Also a quick note about just what you mentioned. So I mean, if it's a public area like Golden Mile Complex, like by all means go. But I think if they tend to be, let's say, rental flats like Dakota, just take note that these are people's homes also, and like don't go treat it like as though you're a tourist there. So that's one thing to take note. Like if you ever document it, if you can like involve the residents in the documentation, just like what the filmmakers did. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for sharing, guys, and thanks for the plug, Jérémy.
It's a great effort, I think. So I'm glad that it came out.
Thank you. Okay, we've got a question from Vincent, and the question is for Fanny and Jérémy. Yuri was a fictional character, but was there any movement by the residents or interested parties like Jonathan and Jérémy for Dakota that wanted to save the actual building of Gagarine, or was it always like a foregone conclusion by the residents that it's going to be demolished anyway and nothing could be done?
I don't think there was any group of inhabitants trying to save the building properly, because it took so much time before people had a clear decision. During almost 10 years, they were informed that it wasn't going to be demolished but rehabilitated, and then no, finally was going to be demolished, yes and no. So at the end, many of the people from Gagarine was kind of tired of the situation. Then I think just wanted a clear decision, and many people wanted to go actually. But what I can say is that something very special happened during the last years of Gagarine. Just like maybe at the end of a love story where everything becomes much stronger, and the last seconds of it are felt maybe stronger than the years before. Here it was the same feeling. Somehow, even though people knew they were going to go, new associations were being created of women. They built a house of neighbors where many people were meeting, creating new links. Even though it was going to be finished in a few years, there was a revival somehow, and we were welcomed by this revival also, and it helped us a lot to meet the people and create links with them. And so it was not a fight to save the building, but I feel it was somehow a fight to save the community, at least.
Actually, where did most of the community go after?
Well, it's a communist city, Ivry-sur-Seine, and many of the people from the city hall actually lived also in the building with the inhabitants. And the city took care that everybody would be replaced in the city. And most of the people we know who were relocated were quite happy with the new home where they were. But of course, they were not all replaced in the same place. So there was a division.
So you mentioned about twin building that you shot in. The twin building was not demolished. Was it still there?
Yes, it's not exactly twin. It looks like, but the construction is more.
Well done.
Yeah, solid, well done. The Gagarine, Cité Gagarine was very close from the rails of the train, so very noisy, and the isolation was bad. The other one is a bit older, but with balconies and a bit better. So it will, and it's protected by it's a protected architecture.
We've also got another question at this point, and it's quite a suppose cheeky, interesting one. So, are there any fun ghost stories or urban myths to share about these places?
Well, maybe for us it's not a ghost story, but it's an interesting story. We were looking for our main character, Yuri, within the inhabitants of Gagarine. Of course, we would have loved to find our Yuri among the young people who grew up in Gagarine, but we didn't. So it took 6 months to find our Yuri, and finally we met Alseni Batili. He was in a high school in the north suburbs of Paris, and it was a beautiful encounter. And even though he wasn't properly from Gagarine, during the shooting, his parents visited us, and his father, who is from Senegal and who immigrated to France when he was 20, realized that the very first place where he had slept in France was Gagarine, because he had a relative who lived in the building. So we felt that there was quite a bit of magic with the building and this main character we met through Alseni.
Well, it's almost, yeah, there's some beautiful poetry there. And yep, Bee Thiam?
For Tiong Bahru, we know that there must be ghosts in the film because the name of the place itself is a new cemetery. Yeah, so Tiong Bahru itself used to be a cemetery, and we imagined then that this world in Tiong Bahru, right, is a place where the living and the dead would coexist. Yeah, and of course, I think there were many ghost stories if you ask any of the residents, but I think it is happy ghosts. Yeah.
I think for Dakota, I don't know much. Unless Jérémy, you have stories. I haven't heard of any ghost stories.
No.
No, don't know, and don't want to know about
maybe they're all
the dark
kind
side.
souls. Yeah,
They're probably all at the projector.
Yeah.
In fact, when we were doing the pre-production of Tiong Bahru, we even participated in the neighborhood Hungry Ghost Festival, where they would close down the whole street, right, and have different kind of ceremonies and rituals, and it is actually very celebratory. Yeah, and when we go from like units to units to look for a flat to shoot in, we would ask about what are the story of this unit, and things like that. Yeah, it's pretty fun.
Okay, we've got another question from the audience. This is from Ron Tan. So, so I'm going to summarize this one. It's quite a long question. I think So basically, with the world in a constant change and the need to modernize, we are losing culture and heritage. Are we losing culture and heritage, or is it a necessary change to not hold on to material things? Shall I repeat that so you can think about it? Okay,
No.
I'll repeat.
No, I want to stay optimistic. So I
Okay.
will not. I don't know. I guess we are inventing and reinventing our cultures all the time. But that's true that it's sad to see. I don't know. In France, I think we have many laws now that protects architecture and sometimes even too much. So some buildings will become museum, or so it's a hard balance to find, I think. But I don't know. I've been in Lebanon, where all the patrimony, the heritage, architectural heritage, is completely under the rules of capitalism, and it's so sad to see that almost anything will remain from the 60s. Or but some association or people are, I think there are always people to fight for that, and it's so important. And at the same time also, I feel like the cities are evaluating, and we have to also maybe have faith in a natural evolution of things, and don't be afraid of losing the past. I don't know.
I think for Tiong Bahru Social Club, it is an anti-capitalistic film, I would say. It is, I mean, we have, like places like Tiong Bahru, or even like Chimes and other places that was built, that was conserved, right? And yet, I think a lot of the buildings that was built by some of our pioneer architects after independence, they are slowly, like either being demolished or left to neglect. So I feel that it sort of reflects, I think, our society in terms of what we feel is important or should be saved. Are we leaving behind like a whole lot of colonial buildings instead of, I think, some of the finest works, right, by our pioneer architects? I think it's something for us to think about. In the film itself, I mean, you have a place like Pearl Bank, but on the other hand, when you have a place like Tiong Bahru that is so successful, right, in terms of building a neighborhood that is so loved, so I mean, in the film, it becomes like a franchise, almost like how they would franchise Tiong Bahru Chwee Kueh, right? You can find that not only in Tiong Bahru today, but in Clementi, Bedok, and other places. Can such places, right, flavors, right, be duplicated and franchised around the world? Then that becomes also something that is very scary, right, when we think of it in terms of the capitalistic forces, in terms of preservation. Yeah, so I think the film is a reflection, right, on capitalism. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, maybe I'll just chime in a little bit. I think for me, my answer to that question is yes, I fear that nations are in general. But I say yes more for Singapore, because the way that we view, or rather, I think the way we view conservation now, right, it's more about conserving the building, whereas what I learned quite recently, that heritage does not equate to building, but heritage actually equates to communities. So that is something that we sort of are slowly trying to grapple with. So in Singapore, if we only keep the buildings and we evict people, I think that's a trip down a very slippery slope in time to come, right? So I think it's time that we have a very paradigm shift away from that usual way of conservation, when we think of conservation, do we think about people? Do we think about the program, the activities that occupy the space, or we just think about buildings all the way? So I think this is something that we need to rethink and shift our mindsets about.
Yeah, I think, 100% with all of this. And I think ultimately, I think it's just quite sad. As in, I can only speak for Singapore, is that I think a lot of our buildings are, I quote, we're one of the few countries that the buildings, architects outlive a lot of the buildings. And also a lot of the reasoning behind why the buildings disappear and why, let's say, we want to build on top of it is saying like, oh, it's breaking down and all that. But I think if the culture is that we are planning for obsolescence and not planning for legacy, then we will not make good buildings that last. So it starts, I think, with the intention and the culture too, so that we can, so just to answer the second part of the question, it's not a necessary change. I wouldn't say it's always an improvement. Yeah.
Great, guys. Thanks for sharing. Final question that we have from the audience is actually directed at Fanny and Jérémy. Could you share what your next projects might be?
We are working on 2 different projects now. We are on the writing process. We work in a French film that tells a very different story in a different context, with lots of children in it. And the other film is in English language. It will be taking place in the States, actually, and it's going further in the science fiction mood that Gagarine began to explore.
And do these also kind of involve similar themes as Gagarine, or like something different? Or can you not talk about it?
No, I think we will always try to root in a place, because meeting people and communities is really a motor for us to write. And we need to be involved in real life, I think, to write stories.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you guys for sharing. I'm also conscious of the time, so I think with that we will wrap up this panel. Thank you everyone for being here. Before that, I have to also apparently plug a book giveaway that we're doing, which is we're giving away 10 copies of They Told Us to Move, Dakota Acacia. And so simply get tickets to Gagarine at the projector from now till the 8th of August, and then look out for our announcement on the 10th of August, and winners will be selected at random and contacted by email or your phone numbers for collection of the book. So special thanks to Ethos Books for making this possible. And just thank you everybody for being here, for attending this. Thank you panelists, all of you for that really interesting and insightful discussion. And also for everybody else, please share and encourage everyone else to watch these screenings at these films at the projector. So thank you guys very much.
Thank you so much for inviting
Nice to meet
us.
you.
Thank you.
It was very interesting to listen to you all. Thank you guys.
Yeah.